A flight attendant zip-tied a black CEO's hands for non-compliance. But 15 minutes later, the CIA boarded the plane with a warrant that silenced the entire crew. He zip-tied the black CEO's hands mid-flight, thinking he'd finally put a problem passenger in his place. He didn't know the man he restrained had a clearance level that outranked the sky itself. Subscribe if you believe abusing power always summons something bigger. Sir, you'll need to place that under the seat in front of you. The voice came sharp and sudden, breaking the hush of first class like a crack through glass. Draven Cole didn't flinch. He was already lowering his briefcase into position beneath the seat. His movements were slow, deliberate, precise. The kind of control honed not just by boardroom politics but by years navigating defense negotiations, classified environments, and rooms where a single wrong word could cost a legacy. "Already done," he said calmly without looking up, but the pause that followed told him something was off. He lifted his gaze. The flight attendant stood a few feet away, hand still clutched to the seat back as if frozen mid-movement. He wasn't smiling. His name tag read Rylan, and his eyes, sharp, pale, scanning, locked onto Draven with an intensity far beyond what a routine check required. Draven met the stare evenly. He had traveled under aliases before. Marcel Venton wasn't new. It was standard protocol whenever confidential contracts were involved. This flight to Vallisburg was meant to be smooth, quiet, unremarkable. A stepping stone toward a private meeting that could shift the entire defense cyber landscape of the Republic. He had rehearsed every detail, except this. Ryland's hand slid toward his side, fingers brushing a small communication handset clipped to his waistband. He pressed the side discreetly, voice low but unmistakable in tone. "Front cabin, this is Maris. I have eyes on the alert match." The words made no sense to the surrounding passengers, but they landed like a punch to Draven's senses. Alert match? He kept his face still, but his mind sharpened instantly. Someone had inserted his alias into a system flag. Someone wanted him monitored, possibly worse. Across the aisle, a young man in business attire adjusted his headphones, oblivious to the sudden chill that had settled over row 1A. Further back, a child's tablet beeped out animated noises, completely detached from the slow, invisible current now flowing beneath the surface of this aircraft. Draven leaned back in his seat. He adjusted the strap of his wristwatch with his thumb, tightening it against his skin with a faint metallic click. A habit he'd developed over the years, one only activated when he felt the winds shift in unfamiliar directions. Stay observant. Stay silent. Let them speak first. Rylan lingered in the aisle, eyes twitching slightly, jaw clenched. His body language wasn't aggressive yet, but it was poised. The kind of stance a man took when he expected something to go wrong, when he wanted it to. As if he needed proof that his suspicion was justified, Draven's thoughts moved in layers. Who had access to his alias? Who had reason to interfere with this flight? The negotiation at Vallisburg was critical, yes, but sensitive enough to provoke sabotage? He had kept the circle tight, unbreakably tight. The PA system crackled above. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've closed the cabin doors and are awaiting clearance for takeoff. Estimated flight time to Vallisburg is 1 hour and 37 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure." The voice ended. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft golden glow. A gentle chime signaled readiness. Still, Rylan remained rooted near Draven's seat, lips slightly parted, gaze unwavering. Then, almost reluctantly, he turned and walked briskly toward the galley, disappearing behind the curtain. Draven didn't move. Every fiber of his training was alert now. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a systems strategist, a pattern reader. And this pattern, it didn't align. The energy wasn't random. It was curated, planted. Who's watching the watcher? He reached down, straightened the fold in his pants leg, and leaned his head back as if preparing for a nap. His eyelids lowered, but his mind remained awake, focused. From behind the curtain, faint murmurs passed, Rylan again, whispering fast, his voice thin with urgency. A shadow moved, another crew member. Neither approached the first-class cabin again, but the tension lingered, as if the air itself had been rewritten. A passenger coughed. Another sipped from a glass of water. Someone flipped a page in a hardcover novel, the mundane sounds of travel. But beneath them, a new silence grew, the kind that comes before a storm, the kind that carries weight, not noise, but density. The plane rumbled slightly as the engines roared to life. Movement began. The wheels rolled. Outside the oval windows, the runway stretched into shadow, and the horizon glowed with the last traces of orange from the fading sun. But inside, all warmth had vanished from the air. Draven exhaled slowly through his nose. He knew what this was now. Not a random altercation, not even a misidentification. It was a setup, and the most dangerous kind, the one born from half-truths wrapped in official language protocol, twisted just enough to justify action. Action that someone, somewhere, hoped would provoke a man like him. But he wouldn't give them that, he never had. The wheels lifted from the earth. The cabin lights flickered once. Above them, the clouds thickened like curtains drawing across a stage. And below, unknown to everyone but two men locked in silent tension, one with calm, the other with certainty, a line had already been crossed. The storm forming around him had no warning signs, only shadows. Turbulence struck without warning, jostling the overhead bins and causing several passengers to clutch their armrests. The sudden shake gave flight attendant Rylan Maris the opening he'd been waiting for. Without hesitation, he moved swiftly down the aisle, his eyes locked on the man in seat 2A, Draven Cole, traveling under the alias Marcel Venton. Rylan's footsteps were firm, his jaw set, professionalism masking the tension tightening his posture. "I need to see your identification," Rylan said sharply, leaning in just enough for his voice to be heard over the hum of the engines and the soft chime of the seatbelt sign. Draven turned his head, expression calm, eyes unreadable. "The flight is already airborne. You scanned my pass at boarding." "This is protocol," Rylan snapped. "You've been flagged in an internal alert system. I'm authorized to verify your identity mid-flight." Around them, passengers began to shift in their seats. A man, one row back, leaned subtly into the aisle. A younger traveler lowered his earbuds, sensing something unusual. Draven remained still, his breath steady, his gaze fixed on Rylan's trembling hands. "Boarding pass," Draven said calmly, reaching with precision into the side compartment and retrieving it with deliberate clarity. Rylan snatched it, barely glancing at the text before folding it in half. "Doesn't mean you're not non-compliant," he muttered, loud enough for at least 4 people to hear. His tone carried the sharp edge of authority, but underneath, a crack of anxiety echoed. The moment stretched. Draven watched the way Rylan's right thumb tapped compulsively against his utility pouch. It wasn't the behavior of a professional managing a protocol. It was the rhythm of someone trying to convince himself he was right. That was more dangerous than outright malice. "I've done nothing wrong," Draven stated, calm yet firm. "I've complied fully. Whatever alert you've received must be an error." "You matched a flagged profile," Rylan replied, pulling his shoulders back. "I'm authorized to take precautionary action to ensure the safety of this flight." The implication dropped heavily, audible to the surrounding passengers. Several stiffened in their seats. A man across the aisle turned his phone toward the scene, camera silently recording. Draven's voice lowered. "And what action do you believe is justified?" "You're to be restrained," Rylan answered, his voice firm but not steady. "For the safety of this cabin, I'm placing you under protective hold." Without waiting for consent, he pulled out a pair of industrial-grade zip ties. Draven's pupils narrowed slightly. His instincts sharpened, not with fear, but with preparation. The logic was clear. Resisting would only validate Rylan's spiraling assumptions. Remaining calm was his only weapon, his only shield. "You're escalating a situation that didn't exist," Draven warned softly. But Rylan didn't listen. He leaned forward and, with shaking fingers, looped the zip ties around Draven's wrists, tightening them against the metal armrest. The sound, the quiet, plasticky clicks of each notch, rang louder than the aircraft's engines in that moment. A gasp echoed from the rear of the cabin. Another phone rose, recording. "I said, stay still," Rylan barked, though Draven hadn't moved. Passengers froze. A child asked what was happening. A father hissed for his son to stay quiet. The scene had changed, shifted from orderly service to unsettling spectacle. Draven exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the cabin. 3 rows ahead, a man in an unassuming blazer sat rigid, his hands on his lap. The telltale bulge of a shoulder holster was barely visible beneath the fabric air marshal. But the man did nothing, his body language uncertain, hesitant. Either he wasn't briefed properly, or he doubted the integrity of the unfolding situation. That doubt could cost time. Or worse. Rylan stepped back, chest heaving slightly, then leaned closer and whispered, "You're not going to ruin this flight." His words weren't grounded in logic, they were rooted in paranoia. Draven didn't reply. He didn't need to. Instead, his attention drifted subtly across the cabin. The positions of the crew, the overhead intercom still untouched, the placement of his briefcase kicked partially under the seat during the restraint. Every angle was logged, mapped, stored. His mind was already restructuring the playing field. Rylan resumed pacing. His hands fidgeted, adjusting the strap on his wristwatch, straightening his name tag. But his confidence was performative. He was unraveling, and only Draven could see it. Tension continued to mount with every minute. A flight attendant from economy peeked in, hesitated at the sight, then vanished back through the curtain. No one challenged the restraint. Not yet. Fear of being wrong, of getting involved, of becoming the next target, kept everyone locked in silence. The engines droned onward. The plane cut through a pocket of air, shuddering briefly. The passengers jolted in their seats, but the real turbulence wasn't from the sky. Draven adjusted slightly, testing the zip ties, not with force, but with calculation. His fingers, bound at the wrists, explored the give, the angle, the tension. Above them, the seatbelt sign glowed red. Outside, clouds thickened, shadows rolling across the windows like a silent omen. No one aboard that flight knew what this moment truly was. Not a misunderstanding, not a security measure, but a carefully placed trigger meant to set off a chain reaction. Draven didn't blink. And with each click of the tightening zip ties, the truth grew darker. The plastic bite of the zip ties burned into Draven Cole's wrists. His arms were pinned tightly to the steel armrests of Seat 1A, and yet his posture remained composed, shoulders back, chin steady, breath quiet. Years of dealing with hostile negotiations, corporate espionage, and calculated threats had taught him the one thing that mattered most in crisis. Control was an internal affair. Across the aisle, murmurs stirred like rising static. The passengers hadn't fully processed what they had just witnessed. Some clutched their phones under tray tables, recording in secrecy. Others wore the tight-lipped silence of fear, uncertain whether to trust the man in the uniform or the one in restraints. Rylan Maris, the flight attendant, stalked the aisle like a man on a mission only he understood. His jaw clenched as he reached for his shoulder radio, then turned slightly toward the cockpit. The turbulence outside had passed, but a more dangerous storm had taken hold inside the cabin. "This is Flight 309, Rylan spoke low into the radio, a tremor in his voice masked poorly by a layer of authority. "Cabin code 17. Passenger attempted to reach for my equipment. Recommend further restraint upon landing." From the front of the cockpit, a brief, static-sliced voice responded with hesitation. "Copy that. Clarify. Physical altercation confirmed?" Ryland's eyes slid toward Draven. Draven didn't move, didn't blink. That was enough. "Confirmed," Ryland replied firmly, voice gaining edge. He reached for my belt. Lies, Draven heard the words echo in the cabin like thunder wrapped in velvet. A lie so bold it had weight, the kind that turned silence into suspicion. 3 rows back, a man stirred, broad-shouldered, wearing a generic navy polo, his eyes darting between the 2 men. Draven's gaze slid to him momentarily, air marshal. He carried himself with forced nonchalance, but his grip on the armrest betrayed unease. He wasn't stepping in. That was the clue Draven needed if the air marshal wasn't acting. Then he either didn't believe Ryland's story or had been instructed not to intervene. "Control," Draven reminded himself. "Let them show their cards." Ryland moved next. He leaned down, unzipping the outer pouch of Draven's briefcase with a confidence that suggested he thought he was doing something heroic. "You don't have my consent to," Draven began, but stopped himself. He knew the trap. Any resistance, any firmness, and the narrative Ryland was already spinning would anchor deeper. "Quiet," Ryland snapped. "You forfeited your rights when you matched the bulletin." He rifled through the contents, tossing aside a sleek pen, a notepad, and then froze. His hand emerged, holding a series of slim black folders marked with a silver geometric emblem. Varian Systems. Encrypted files. Non-lethal confidential. Unmarked to the average eye, but instantly recognizable to anyone in defense or tech circles. "What? What is this?" Ryland muttered, narrowing his eyes as if expecting to uncover blueprints for a weapon. Draven said nothing. Speaking now would only feed the fire. Ryland opened one of the folders but was met with a digital panel that flickered red. "Access denied. Executive level only." His jaw tightened. He interpreted it wrong, convinced he had found contraband, proof of something sinister. Across the cabin, a male passenger in his 20s suddenly stood. "Hey, I saw the whole thing," he said, voice shaky but loud enough to break the fog of silence. "That guy didn't do anything. You came at him." Ryland's head snapped around. "Sit down," he barked. "Remain seated, or I'll have you detained for interfering with the federal protocol." The young man hesitated, then slowly sat back down, glancing apologetically at Draven. Fear had done its job. Ryland had isolated his target, one zip tie and one threat at a time. Draven studied every inch of Ryland's face now. There was sweat along his temples. His lips moved faintly, whispering something to himself. His fingers fidgeted with the radio dial. He wasn't just executing orders. He was unraveling, trying to keep control of a script he barely understood. "Protocols have changed," Ryland muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Draven to catch the phrase hit like a dropped pin in a silent room. There it was, confirmation that someone had fed Ryland a new playbook. Outside of standard procedure, someone had told him to expect a threat. Someone had planted a bulletin that changed the stakes. And now, that misinformation had taken form in the shaking hands of a flight attendant on the verge of collapse. Draven's mind recalibrated. He leaned slightly into his restraints, letting his body read the resistance in the zip ties. Not enough give no easy escape. But escape wasn't the goal. Perception was. "Tell me something," Draven said calmly, voice low. "Did they tell you why I was dangerous? Or just that I was?" Ryland's eyes flicked up. There was a hesitation, a crack. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "You don't belong up here. Not with that name, not with that face." There it was, the bias, the buried prejudice, now bubbling to the surface under stress and manipulation. Not just protocol. It was personal now. Draven leaned back, not with defeat, but with clarity. He had seen it before. In boardrooms, in backdoor contracts, in the gaze of competitors who underestimated him. The plane rumbled gently beneath them. Slicing through a corridor of clouds, Draven closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in surrender, but to listen. The hum of the engines, the shuffle of shoes, the click of a phone camera 3 rows back. Everything was being recorded. The narrative wasn't just in Ryland's voice anymore. It was in every angle, every lens, every silence. And so he waited, not for rescue, but for revelation, because the truth wasn't in the briefcase. It was in the unraveling mind of the man who thought he was holding power. The real battle was no longer physical, it was narrative. The encrypted message came through the cockpit console with a sharp digital ping, sharp enough to make First Officer Jaron Thale pause mid-sentence. The captain, Elias Moron, leaned forward, brows tightening as the words "Directive, Azure, Level 4" appeared in pulsating blue font. His hands hovered over the controls, uncertain whether to reply, decode, or brace. Protocol dictated silence until confirmation. But even before he could decide, a second ping followed, urgent, coded, and tagged with a clearance level far above anything they usually encountered on domestic flights. "Captain," Jaron said quietly, "that's an override signal. Do we stand by?" Captain Marin hesitated, his jaw clenched. "We hold. Keep altitude steady. Do not inform cabin yet." Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, Ryland Maris stood with arms stiff at his sides, posture too straight, too rehearsed, like a man trying to convince himself of his own authority. His voice rang out with theatrical control, but the tremor behind the words betrayed him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "an internal threat has been neutralized. Remain calm. Do not interfere." The passengers stiffened, glancing toward Draven Cole, still restrained, still silent, his wrists bound tightly to the armrests. Murmurs flitted like sparks between rows. A young man reached slowly for his phone, but tucked it away when Ryland's eyes snapped toward him. No one moved. Draven's eyes, however, moved constantly, calculating, scanning, waiting. From his seat, he could hear the change in the aircraft's tone. A subtle deceleration. A descent, not steep, but deliberate. It didn't match their intended route to Vallisburg. Draven leaned slightly, not enough to provoke Ryland, just enough to peer past the window's edge. And there it was. A faint blinking light, distant at first, then growing steadily closer, a rhythm only recognizable to a few men on the planet. Draven was one of them. He didn't blink. His breath slowed. From the aisle, Ryland caught the direction of Draven's gaze and followed it. The escort aircraft was now visible, a sleek gray shadow riding parallel to them, silent but undeniable. Ryland's face lit up, not with fear, but with the satisfaction of vindication. He whispered, more to himself than anyone, "You're finished." His hand moved to tighten the zip ties again, perhaps out of fear, perhaps control. The plastic cut deeper into Draven's wrists, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head just slightly and studied Ryland's expression. Delusion, Draven realized. Not confidence, not protocol. Delusion fueled by a false narrative. A man so desperate to matter, he'd tied his identity to a phantom directive. Inside the cockpit, Captain Marin activated the emergency frequency. A garbled tone buzzed for a moment, then cleared. "Vanguard response. This is Aurelius Flight 309. We've received Directive Azure. Requesting verification and flight vector correction." Silence. Then a voice crackled through, measured, calm, and unfamiliar. "Flight 309. Hold current position. Do not engage course correction. Assistance is en route." Captain Maron and Jaron exchanged glances. That voice wasn't from flight operations or the tower. It wasn't even civilian. It came from somewhere deep within internal security networks, somewhere even pilots weren't supposed to acknowledge back in the cabin. The air grew heavy. Passengers leaned slightly, straining to see out the windows as the escort aircraft drifted closer. The blinking pattern changed. A subtle code. Not for civilians, not even for the airline, but Draven recognized it instantly. 3 blinks, pause, 2, then 4. The code for an airborne external intelligence override. It meant Do not resist. Operation in progress. Draven's eyes narrowed. His instincts had been correct. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a move. A deliberate, orchestrated maneuver by someone with clearance and motive. Rylan, however, saw only what he wanted to see. He paced again, loudly assuring nearby passengers that everything was under control. But his fingers twitched and his voice cracked slightly on the word secure. Draven watched the deterioration unfold in real time. You think they're here for you, Rylan whispered, leaning close to Draven's face. His breath was uneven. But they're not. They're here because I stopped you. Draven tilted his head. His voice was low, calm. You still don't know who I am, do you? Rylan pulled back, startled by the question. In the aisle, one of the passengers, a man in his 40s wearing a business coat, stood halfway up. I think you should let him go, he said cautiously. Rylan's response was immediate and sharp. Sit down. You are interfering with federal containment protocol. The man raised his hands and sat, but several phones were now discreetly raised, recording. Outside, the escort aircraft dipped slightly, falling into a holding pattern as the larger plane began its approach vector, no longer toward Vallisburg, but toward a location the passengers had never heard of. Vanguard Field. Rylan didn't recognize the change in course. Draven did. His breath slowed further. He shifted his fingers within the restraints, feeling the taut plastic against his skin. Not to break it, just to test it. Measure it. Catalog every sensation. Preparation wasn't a reaction. It was a habit. From the cockpit, the captain's voice came over the intercom again, more controlled this time, but with an undercurrent of pressure. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an elevated security protocol, we are being diverted to an alternate landing zone. Please remain seated and await further instructions. Rylan nodded as if the message was his victory. I told you, he said to no one in particular. They're handling it now. Draven looked away from him, toward the escort aircraft still holding position outside. The light blinked again, once, then again. Another code. Extraction protocol initiated. He closed his eyes for a moment, grounding himself in the rhythm of the aircraft. The whisper of wind past the fuselage, the creak of floor panels as tension mounted. His mind moved through possibilities like chess moves, 10 steps ahead, then 20. This wasn't about the flight anymore. It never had been. It was about why he had been flagged in the first place. Who knew his alias? Who altered a secure system to trigger a false bulletin? And what exactly were they hoping would happen while he sat bound at 30,000 feet? The final blink of the escort aircraft's signal answered the last question. They wanted to see what would happen when the wrong man restrained the right one. As Rylan paced once more, mumbling half-formed warnings and justifications to himself, Draven straightened slightly in his seat, not with resistance, but with readiness. The aircraft cut through the cloud cover, and the runway of Vanguard Field came into view. Narrow, rain-slick, and flanked by security lights, Draven breathed in. What arrived next was not backup. It was truth with a badge. The escort aircraft tilted closer, its lights cutting sharp blue lines through the clouds like a knife across velvet. Draven saw it before anyone else, a flicker just beyond the cabin's right wing. Its formation was no accident, no routine safety check. That flash pattern, 3 long pulses followed by 2 short, was a code, a high-clearance recognition signal. Only a handful of men in the country would recognize it. Draven was one of them. Bound to his seat by industrial zip ties that bit into his wrists, Draven remained still, but his mind had already shifted into high gear. Each second was a calculation, each breath measured against the growing tension inside the cabin. The sky outside was darkening with altitude, but it was inside where the storm gathered, and Rylan Maris was its thunderhead. The passengers, still tense from the earlier confrontation, leaned into the aisle, whispering nervously, eyes flicking between the windows and the agitated flight attendant. Rylan had taken the arrival of the escort aircraft as a badge of vindication. He mistook the code for confirmation. To him, backup had arrived, backup to haul Draven away in chains. "They're here for you," Rylan muttered without turning, his voice a low rasp of triumph. Draven didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed out the window. He watched the escort hold formation, its precision too deliberate, its presence too loud in a sky that rarely carried such company. It wasn't here for surveillance. It was here for intervention. Rylan paced erratically in front of the cabin door, one hand on his earpiece, the other tightening and retightening his grip on a utility pouch already half unzipped. He tugged the zip ties binding Draven's wrists once more, harder this time, as if reaffirming control. "This is containment," Rylan barked, turning sharply toward a curious passenger 2 rows back who had stood up. "Remain seated." The passenger sat quickly, startled, while another nearby angled his phone discreetly, camera lens visible just between 2 fingers. He wasn't alone. Several passengers had begun filming now, their hands low but lenses pointed forward. Rylan either didn't notice or didn't care. Draven's breath moved evenly. The only part of him that did. He didn't resist. Not yet. Restraint was no longer just a physical matter. It was tactical. He needed to preserve the moment exactly as it was, let it unravel with witnesses, with footage, with undeniable proof. His wrists stung, circulation pinched, but he focused past the discomfort. A sudden shift in tone came over the intercom. The captain's voice, earlier clipped with authority, now carried hesitation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently in contact with ground support regarding an updated flight protocol. Please remain calm and seated." That one word, updated, was a signal in itself. It meant control had shifted. The captain wasn't piloting under normal orders anymore. Someone higher had taken command. "See?" Rylan hissed with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Even the cockpit knows." Draven's eyes flicked to the cockpit door, locked. Silent. But he noticed a small detail. Subtle, almost invisible to the untrained. The cabin's alert panel near the ceiling had changed from standard green to pale amber. It was a code used in select operations to signify classified override. Rylan didn't see it. He was too busy feeding his own illusion. From his seat, Draven shifted his fingers within the zip ties, not enough to escape, but enough to assess circulation, tension, and angle. Not for now, for later. "Passenger in 1A is secured," Rylan said into his communicator, pacing again. "Awaiting retrieval instructions. Escort aircraft confirms." His voice trembled, the cracks beginning to show. Across the aisle, a man in business casual leaned toward another, whispering, "He's losing it." The other nodded, eyes wide, phone still recording. The hum of the engines was now underscored by a deeper tension, one of silence waiting to erupt. Then came the next fracture. The first officer cracked the cockpit door just a sliver and called out, "Rylan, who authorized your clearance?" The question hung in the air like a suspended blade. Rylan turned sharply. "I have Level 3 advisories. Clearance issued through emergency protocol." "That's not on file," the officer replied flatly, his voice without emotion. "Where did it come from?" Rylan didn't answer. Not immediately. His lips parted, then closed. He looked back at Draven, then to the passengers watching, filming. His stance hardened as he snapped, "I don't need to explain myself to you. Stand down." The first officer remained behind the door. No further words came, but the silence said enough. Doubt had entered the cockpit, and with it, collapse had begun. Outside the window, the escort aircraft shifted again, lower now, tighter. Draven watched its belly lights flicker in a new pattern. 2 short bursts, a long beam, then nothing. The next phase was close. A man in the second row raised his phone higher now, voice steady as he spoke into the lens. "He just said, 'They're coming for you.'" but the pilot's tone doesn't match. This is getting crazy. Ryland's eyes flicked toward the voice. "Put that away," he snapped, but the man didn't. Neither did the others. More phones were recording now. Draven could feel the weight of the narrative shifting, not because of force, but because the silence that once protected Ryland's delusions had broken. Evidence was accumulating, moment by moment, second by second. Ryland turned back to Draven, kneeling slightly, voice low. "You know what you did. You triggered this. I'm just the one who had the courage to stop it." Draven tilted his head slightly. "You don't even know what this is." The words were calm, almost surgical, designed to cut without force. Ryland recoiled, confusion and anger warring in his expression. But before he could speak again, a distant sound echoed, faint but unmistakable, the deep, vibrating roar of another aircraft engine aligning overhead. Something was descending, and it wasn't commercial. Draven's pulse remained steady. He counted the beats between sounds, the spacing between light signals, the duration of silence inside the cabin. Everything pointed to one truth. The next few minutes would decide everything. Unknown to Ryland, the man he tied was the reason the sky had company. The overhead chime pierced the murmuring tension of the cabin as the captain's voice cut in, calm but unmistakably off-script. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to operational advisories, we are diverting to Vanguard Field, estimated arrival in 20 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." A collective ripple moved through the passengers, confused glances, hushed questions, the low murmur of uncertainty blooming into panic just beneath the surface. Draven Cole, still bound at the wrists with industrial zip ties, sat motionless, eyes forward, his breath even, but his mind sharpening like a blade under pressure. Ryland Maris turned slowly from the service galley, a grin crawling across his face as he walked the aisle with theatrical authority. His shoulders were squared, his jaw set with a twisted kind of pride, like a man who believed the spotlight had finally landed on him. He stopped beside Draven's seat, leaned down and whispered with gloating satisfaction, "The authorities will handle you soon enough." Draven didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on the front bulkhead, unblinking, calm. But inside, a silent war had begun. He wasn't thinking about humiliation or revenge. He was analyzing who crafted the forged alert, what gain justified this airborne charade, and why now, on the very day his evidence could expose one of the largest defense frauds in the sector. Thunder rumbled distantly outside, dull and throaty, as if the storm itself was waiting for the cabin to break. Ryland paced again, his eyes scanning passengers like a self-appointed marshal, emboldened by the detour. "We're landing on a restricted field," he said loudly, his voice rising to be heard. "This is standard protocol for internal threat detainment." A passenger near the emergency exit looked up, startled. Another clutched his phone tighter, filming discreetly beneath a folded blanket. Draven's fingers shifted against the edge of the armrest, subtly testing the give of the zip ties. Not to break them, not yet. Just enough to calculate mobility. His wrists were beginning to ache, the plastic biting into skin, but he needed the discomfort. Pain was data. It sharpened awareness. He took a deep breath, slow and deliberate, syncing it with the vibrations underfoot. In seat 3C, a man with salt and pepper hair, Kellen Durst, a mid-tier analyst flying home, typed a short message into a secure browser app. Flight attendant exhibiting aggressive restraint, passenger not resisting. Urgent, verified chain of command. He hit send, unaware that the message was automatically rerouted through layered encryption protocols and into the secure incident feed of Varian Systems' internal task force. 2 rows back, the off-duty air marshal sat frozen, eyes darting between Ryland and the cockpit. He gripped his armrest but made no move to intervene. Either out of confusion or fear of breaking protocol before clarification arrived, Draven noted it. Another pawn, not an ally. Outside, the escort aircraft adjusted its position, drawing nearer with surgical precision. The gleaming white fuselage bore no clear markings, but Draven recognized the subtle pattern of strobe signals along the underbelly, 3 blinks. 2-second pause. 4 more. It was not random. A classified formation code. His eyes narrowed and he adjusted his posture slightly. Whatever was unfolding below them wasn't standard response. It was a synchronized extraction procedure. They weren't diverting because of Ryland's alert. They were responding in spite of it. Ryland returned again, this time tightening the zip ties with a short, forceful tug. "Don't move. I know what you're trying to do," he muttered. Draven met his eyes for the first time since takeoff. "What do you think I'm trying to do?" Ryland's pupils trembled for a split second, betraying the fear under his bluster. "You triggered a national alert. You think you can manipulate your way out of this? Not this time." "You read an alert," Draven said evenly. "You didn't verify it." Ryland's face flushed with confusion and anger. "I don't need to verify federal protocol. I acted." Draven didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence was heavier than accusation. It made Ryland retreat a step, muttering something under his breath before storming down the aisle. The cabin lights dimmed further as the aircraft descended slowly. The outside world cast in a grim wash of gray storm clouds and flashes of distant lightning. The hum of the engines changed pitch, signaling the shift in altitude, and several passengers gasped as the plane tilted, angling into its approach. A quiet beep sounded overhead, seatbelt signs locking in, and the captain's voice returned, lower this time, almost hesitant. "We are on final descent. Please remain seated until further notice." Ryland stood again near the galley, bracing himself as the cabin jolted with a burst of wind. He looked over his shoulder at Draven like a man expecting a medal. "They'll know I did what had to be done," he muttered to himself, loud enough for those nearby to hear, but not loud enough to drown out the irony. Help had already been in motion long before Ryland fastened his first zip tie. Draven focused on the shifting air pressure, the slowing turbines, the mechanical thump of the landing gear locking into place. The escort jet had dropped into trail position, its presence a silent announcement of coordinated ground response. He noted the timing. Everything was aligning. Timing meant planning, and planning meant someone knew what Ryland would do. As the flaps extended and the aircraft leveled out for its approach, Draven's thoughts narrowed. This wasn't just about sabotage. This was about provoking a public incident, one where someone like Ryland could be weaponized with just enough fake authority to believe he was saving the day. The irony was unbearable. The man who restrained him believed he was diffusing a threat, when in truth he was performing for an invisible audience that had already moved to act. Rain began to scatter across the windows, smearing the view of the approaching tarmac into streaks of silver and shadow. A low boom echoed again, closer now. The escort jet adjusted its position for descent. Draven exhaled once, slow and controlled. He shifted slightly, just enough to ready his feet for balance. The final descent wasn't just physical. It was strategic. Everything that had been set in motion was converging. The closer they came to the ground, the closer the truth came to breaking open. The plane touched down on Vanguard Field with a hard, jarring shudder. The tires screeched against the runway as gusts of wind shoved the aircraft sideways, causing the fuselage to tilt ever so slightly before it corrected itself. The cabin jolted, oxygen masks swayed above, and for a breathless moment, the passengers braced in silence. Then, calm. The aircraft slowed, brakes hissing beneath the metal floor. Passengers clutched armrests, phones, and each other, eyes glued to the windows. And that's when the gasps began. Outside, lined in precision across the tarmac, was a full tactical response team. Helmets, body armor, rifles drawn low but ready emergency lights strobed faintly in the distance. The kind of deployment you'd expect for a hijacking, not a domestic flight. The silence inside the cabin was deafening. Ryland Maris stood rooted near the galley, his eyes wide as he peered through the window. His mouth opened slightly before he turned, pointing a trembling finger toward row 1. "A. He's the one! He's the threat!" he shouted, voice cracking from the strain of panic and certainty clashing inside him. Draven Cole remained still, wrists still zip-tied to the armrests, expression unreadable. His eyes tracked every movement with the calm precision of a man who had stopped reacting and started calculating. But the tactical officers didn't even glance at him. Instead, one raised a gloved hand and made a subtle circling motion. The pilot understood. A soft chime echoed through the intercom system, then a voice, firm and low. "Cabin crew, unlock the cockpit." The captain complied. The sealed door clicked open. From the aisle, Ryland staggered a step back. "Wait, what are they doing? They're not going for him?" His voice had lost its edge. Sweat dotted his brow and his once firm posture deflated under the weight of sudden doubt. The moment cracked wide open when the first two officers boarded the aircraft. Their steps were slow but deliberate, the silence of their entry more terrifying than shouting helmets reflected the overhead lights. Rifles remained angled downward, not raised. This wasn't a raid. It was something colder. Passengers leaned away as the team swept down the aisle, eyes scanning, formation tight, but still not a glance toward Draven. One officer approached Rylan, pausing a few feet from him. He didn't shout, didn't accuse. His voice was composed, almost clinical. "Step aside, sir." Rylan blinked, confusion overtaking the sweat now beading down his temples. "You don't understand," he stammered. "I already restrained the subject. I followed protocol. He matched the bulletin. He's dangerous." The officer didn't budge. His tone didn't change. "Step aside." "No, you're making a mistake." Rylan raised his voice again, volume climbing with his desperation. "I neutralized a hostile subject. You're too late. I already handled it." The officer finally spoke with enough force to cut through the tension. "We're not here for that man." Rylan's face went slack. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The blood drained from his cheeks as if the oxygen had been sucked from the entire cabin. His hands, once raised in defiance, now hovered mid-air, aimless, shaking. A ripple of whispers passed through the passengers. Phones discreetly recorded faces turned from Draven to Rylan, then back to the officers. Everyone had assumed the man tied to the seat was the reason for this sudden descent into military protocol. But now the narrative was cracking like glass under pressure. Draven remained seated, head slightly tilted, observing the unraveling like a scientist watching a chemical reaction reach its inevitable conclusion. His breathing was steady, his expression unchanged, but behind his eyes, calculations accelerated. Rylan took a step back, bumping into a seat. He opened his mouth again, but no words came out, only a rasp, as if language had abandoned him the moment authority did. The lead officer didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Sir, step away from the passenger." Rylan nodded slowly, as if trying to convince himself that this wasn't real. His hand twitched toward the zip ties around Draven's wrists, but another officer raised a hand, signaling him not to move. Passengers held their breath. Then Rylan staggered sideways, face pale, sweat clinging to his collar. He reached out to the nearest seat for balance. One of the passengers recoiled, not from fear, but from disgust. His voice came out hollow now. "I was just following orders." Draven's gaze finally broke from the officer and settled on Rylan. No words, no smirk, just quiet recognition, like a man staring at the final page of a story that had tried to rewrite itself, and failed. Behind them, another officer stepped aboard. The energy shifted again. But inside the cabin, it was too late for Rylan. His version of events was dissolving faster than he could salvage it. His voice cracked one last time. "You have no idea what you're doing. I was trying to protect everyone." But no one responded. No one believed him anymore. Passengers silently raised their phones again. History was being captured frame by frame. Every expression, every word, every unraveling excuse. And Draven still hadn't moved. The zip ties remained, but his dignity was unshaken, because the power in the cabin had shifted, not by noise, not by panic, but by truth walking quietly through the door in armored boots. The moment the boots hit the aisle, his certainty began to crumble. "Release him now." The lead officer's voice cut through the tense silence like a blade. All eyes in the cabin snapped toward him. Rylan Maris turned, his fingers twitching slightly as if unsure whether to obey or defy. His uniform was wrinkled, his face flushed, and the badge clipped to his chest trembled slightly as his breath quickened. "I can't do that," Rylan said, voice cracking despite the authority he tried to project. "I'm operating under a verified threat alert. He fits the profile he had encrypted files." The officer took a measured step forward, eyes locked on Rylan's. "You were manipulated," he said, voice calm but stern. "That alert was never issued by any recognized aviation authority. It originated from an anonymous digital node traced to a non-secured private network. It was fake." Rylan blinked. His mouth opened, but no words came. For a full second, the cabin seemed to tilt as the reality he built crumbled beneath him. "No," he murmured. "That can't be. I checked it. I saw it." Behind him, Draven Cole remained seated, wrists still bound by thick industrial zip ties, but his expression was unreadable, focused, precise. One of the officers approached him gently, crouching beside his seat with a quiet nod of recognition. "Sir, we're going to remove these now," the officer said, not revealing Draven's identity but treating him with a calm familiarity that did not go unnoticed. Draven nodded once, giving silent permission. His muscles remained still, but his eyes never left Rylan. The plastic ties were carefully snipped away. Draven rolled his wrists, red marks circling his skin like a reminder of the restraint and the lie. The officer helped him up with the respect of someone handling not just a man, but a mission. Rylan stepped back, his hands slightly raised as if to shield himself from the unraveling truth. "Wait, he had encrypted documents," he said, louder now, grasping for some anchor to hold his story together. "He tried to hide them. I saw symbols. I saw—" "Their contract drafts," Draven said quietly, stepping forward. His voice, calm and even, silenced the cabin more effectively than any command. "They were destined for a classified national infrastructure briefing in Vallisburg. They've already passed internal vetting. You tampered with federal documents." Rylan's jaw slackened, the words hitting like physical blows. He looked to the captain for support, but the man stood stone-faced at the cockpit door, unwilling to intervene. The passengers stared, many filming the exchange on their devices, capturing every gesture, every unraveling. "You were wrong," Draven continued, not in anger, but in clarity. "And now we all have to live with what that mistake almost cost." Before Rylan could respond, another officer stepped forward, speaking directly to the captain. "We've been ordered to hold position. Higher clearance units are on their way." Rylan perked up slightly, seizing on the fragment like a drowning man reaching for driftwood. "Good. Aviation Command? Federal investigators?" The officer didn't blink. "No," he replied flatly. "The Central Intelligence Bureau is inbound." The words hung in the cabin like a crack of thunder. Rylan's knees buckled slightly as his back hit the nearby galley wall. His lips moved soundlessly, trying to summon a defense that no longer existed. "CIB?" he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Why would— No one answered. They didn't need to. The presence of the CIB meant the matter had elevated far beyond an in-flight incident. It meant this wasn't just a protocol breach. It was a national threat assessment, one Rylan had unwittingly become part of. Draven watched him with quiet detachment. There was no gloating in his expression, no smirk of revenge. Only resolve. Because he knew the real war hadn't started with zip ties. It had started the moment someone decided to turn his identity into a weapon. Outside the windows, the rain intensified, streaking the glass like whispered warnings. Inside, the cabin had fallen into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the low murmur of tactical agents coordinating with unseen teams. The passengers sat motionless, their earlier whispers drowned by the sheer gravity of what was unfolding before them. One officer gently handed Draven a cloth for his wrists. Another turned to Rylan and motioned for him to remain seated until further notice. But Rylan didn't move. He stood frozen near the galley, eyes wide, chest heaving, caught between the illusion of his authority and the reality of its collapse. The uniformed men weren't the end. They were the prelude. He tightened the zip ties and smirked, bragging to the cabin that protocol was on his side. Unaware, a classified alert had already been triggered from the CEO's ID chip. If you believe arrogance under a uniform always cracks, hit subscribe now, because justice moves faster than fear. A loud clank of metal against metal snapped through the cabin like a starting pistol. Every passenger turned their head toward the sealed aircraft door. Breath caught midair. The boarding stairs had attached. A moment later, the hum of the pressurization system shifted slightly, a subtle but unmistakable sign that the outside world was now pressing against the sealed capsule they'd been trapped inside for over an hour. Then came the sound of deliberate footsteps, slow, sure, and synchronized. 3 men in tailored black suits stepped into the aisle, each carrying the weight of command in their silent presence. They moved with the precision of a closing vault. Their badges shimmered under the cabin lights. CIB, Central Intelligence Bureau. Gasps rippled through the rows. Cell phones, already mid-record, now shook slightly in passengers' hands as the gravity of what they were witnessing settled like cold air in the lungs. These weren't airport security or airline officials. These were men from the Republic's most covert enforcement agency, operatives who rarely revealed themselves in public, let alone on a civilian flight. Every face turned toward them with silent awe. Every breath waited. Draven Cole, still bound to his seat, did not flinch. He didn't need to. The moment his eyes met the lead agent's, a silent exchange occurred. Recognition. Not just as a face, but as a man whose name was etched into layers of security beyond most clearance levels. The lead agent, a tall man with tightly combed silvering hair and a gaze sharp as ice, offered a near imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of both respect and confirmation. Rylan Maris's reaction was the opposite. The flight attendant stumbled backward 2 steps, eyes darting between the badges and the narrow aisle like a cornered animal. His voice, previously inflated by self-righteous authority, cracked as he pointed toward Draven. "Him!" Rylan shouted, his voice laced with desperation. "He's the one! He's the threat! They'll tell you." But none of the agents turned toward Draven. The lead operative stopped just 5 feet from Rylan and calmly opened a sealed leather folio. From it, he withdrew a single envelope, which he slid open with a precision blade, then unfolded the paper inside. His voice was firm, neutral, and utterly final. "Rylan Maris," he said, the name cutting through the cabin like a verdict. "By order of the Central Intelligence Bureau, you are hereby placed under federal detainment on the following preliminary charges: acting on falsified intelligence, unlawful restraint of a secured civilian, and interference with national-level personnel." The silence was deafening. Rylan's mouth parted, but the words wouldn't come. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to reset his understanding of the universe. "No," he said, shaking his head. No, I was following orders. I got the alert. It said this man was dangerous. I neutralized the threat." The agent didn't blink. "The alert you received was never authorized by any branch of national aviation. It was manufactured by a third-party infiltration, traced to a forged digital credential. You were manipulated." Another gasp spread through the cabin, a sound that now echoed like a collective heartbeat. Rylan staggered sideways, his shoulder bumping into the beverage cart. He looked around, expecting someone, anyone, to back him up. But even the pilot at the cockpit door had gone pale, staring without words. Draven remained seated, his wrists still zip-tied, expression unreadable. He had not uttered a word, not even to confirm his own innocence. He didn't need to. The unraveling was happening on its own. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Rylan whispered, his voice now small, distant. I thought he was the threat." The agent didn't respond with sympathy. "Intent does not erase damage," he said, "and your intent was shaped by an enemy you didn't bother to question." Two officers moved forward. One gently but firmly took Rylan by the arm. The other cut the zip ties from Draven's wrists. The contrast was thunderous. One man being freed, the other being shackled. As the cuffs clicked around Rylan's wrists, he collapsed to his knees. "Please," he said, looking up at the lead agent. "Please believe me, I thought I was doing the right thing." But the agent didn't look down. He turned to the pilot and gave a simple command. "Secure the cabin. Passengers will be debriefed in sequence." Cameras continued to roll in trembling hands. Draven slowly flexed his fingers, blood returning to his joints like breath after suffocation. He said nothing, his eyes following Rylan as the man was lifted to his feet and led toward the exit. Outside, the storm that had threatened all night continued to churn. Inside, silence fell once more. Justice didn't walk in loud, it walked in with a warrant. Rylan Maris was dragged down the aisle in handcuffs, his protests echoing hollowly through the cabin. The moment the aircraft door sealed behind him with a mechanical thud, the atmosphere shifted like air after a lightning strike, sharp, charged, and unnervingly quiet. Silence settled not as comfort, but as aftermath. Draven Cole exhaled slowly, his wrists sore and burning where the industrial zip ties had bitten into flesh. One of the CIB agents who remained on board, an older man with a shaved jawline and watchful eyes, approached him without ceremony. "Are you injured, sir?" the agent asked in a low voice, eyes briefly scanning the faint welts on Draven's arms. Draven shook his head. "Not physically," he said, his voice composed even. "But someone went to great lengths to stage that." The agent gave a small nod of acknowledgement but said nothing, stepping aside as Draven rose from the seat where he'd been bound. As he stood, the full weight of what had transpired in the last hour sank into the collective awareness of the passengers. Some watched with wide, stunned eyes. Others lowered their gaze in shame. A few brave souls held up phones, still recording, but now unsure what story they were capturing. Among them, a teenage boy in row 4 gave Draven a silent nod, one that didn't ask for forgiveness, but gave it. The captain stepped into the cabin from the cockpit, his uniform rumpled, face pale, hat clasped nervously in his hands. "Sir," he said, voice trembling slightly as he addressed Draven, I followed the threat report. I didn't know." "You followed protocol," Draven interrupted gently, his tone not accusing but firm. "You didn't manufacture the lie. Someone else did." The captain swallowed hard and nodded, relieved but still shaken. The faint tremor in his fingers didn't go unnoticed. Behind him, the first officer lingered near the cockpit door, watching cautiously, likely replaying every decision made in the air. Guilt was thick in the room, but Draven had no time to manage apologies. The CIB agent beside him received a signal through his earpiece, and moments later, 2 additional agents stepped back into the aircraft through the rear service entrance. One of them carried a data pad. He approached Draven without hesitation. "We've traced the origin of the falsified alert," he said quietly, offering the tablet. "It came from an internal node at Halirex Dynamics. The clearance token used to transmit it was stolen from a low-level contractor. You were targeted, sir. This wasn't a random misfire." Draven took the tablet with his boundless calm, scanning the screen. His fingers paused over a signature line in the code, something he'd seen before. The implications surged into place like puzzle pieces. Halirex wasn't just competing for the national infrastructure contract. They were sabotaging competitors, willing to manipulate the skies themselves mid-air. He lifted his gaze from the screen. This wasn't just corporate, he said. This was strategic, timed, calculated to the minute I stepped on board. The lead agent nodded. We believe so. This attempted character defamation was meant to derail your negotiations in Vallisburg. A ripple of realization moved through Draven's body, but he gave no outward sign beyond a slight tilt of his head. He'd suspected sabotage when the zip ties first closed around his wrists, but not sabotage that risked an entire commercial flight. He was used to competition, to industrial espionage, to whispers in corporate boardrooms and NDA-protected betrayals. But this was warfare masquerading as procedure. He handed the tablet back. Then, this was never about me disrupting a flight. It was about disrupting my credibility and letting someone else walk into that meeting unchallenged. The agent's silence was confirmation enough. Behind them, passengers were slowly rising, the hum of motion returning as the cabin crew, who had remained eerily quiet since the intervention, began directing people to disembark in controlled rows. The atmosphere was still tense, like glass resting on a cliff edge. Draven stepped into the aisle, motioned forward by the agents. He walked slowly, passing rows of faces that mirrored disbelief and awe. A man in business class mouthed, "I'm sorry." A teenage boy gripped the armrest of his seat, staring as though he had just watched a man survive an execution. Draven gave none of them a nod, but his posture, straight-backed, unflinching, was answer enough. Let them see. Let them remember. As he reached the aircraft doorway, the wind hit him like a wall, moist and heavy with the scent of rain and jet fuel. The tarmac glistened with streaks of fresh rainfall, the storm still rumbling faintly in the distant clouds. Lights from the escort vehicles flared against the water-slicked surface, casting long shadows across the steel skin of the plane. Thunder cracked again, softer this time, like a growl retreating into the clouds. Draven stood still for a moment, framed by the threshold. The noise of the cabin dimmed behind him, the cold bite of wind pushing against his shoulders. Somewhere far off, the sound of a chopper rotating to standby filled the air. A younger agent joined him, offering a thermal raincoat. Draven took it with a nod, draping it over his shoulders, his mind already spinning with questions. If Halirex Dynamics had the reach to inject a threat alert into internal flight systems, what else had they tampered with? How long had they been planning this? And who inside the system had looked the other way? The questions would multiply. The damage would spread. But right now, one thing was certain. The sabotage had failed and left behind evidence. He looked down at his wrists again, the red marks faintly fading, symbols of what had nearly been a silent victory for someone else. He turned toward the waiting convoy, stepping into the storm with the silence of a man carrying facts heavier than vengeance. The wind blew rain sideways across the field, pattering against the metal hull behind him. The real conspiracy had only just stepped into the light. Draven stepped through the reinforced glass doors of the operations building, his wrists still faintly marked from the zip ties that had bound him less than an hour ago. Rain struck the rooftop in sharp bursts, echoing across the sterile corridor as two silent CIB officers led him down a narrow hall. The air inside felt heavy, not from humidity, but from the weight of consequence, decisions made, traps laid, and truths on the edge of exposure. Without a word, the guards opened the final door, revealing a secure, dimly lit room lined with tactical monitors and encrypted terminals. Waiting at the center of it all stood Commander Jalen Voren. "Close the door," Jalen said, his voice low, steady. The officers complied, leaving the two men alone. Jalen didn't bother with small talk. He gestured toward the reinforced table between them, sliding a sleek black tablet across the surface. "We traced the forged alert," he said, locking eyes with Draven. It originated inside the airline's internal system, but the access key used wasn't theirs. It belonged to a clearance token stolen 6 months ago from a dormant aerospace contractor. Draven sat slowly, never looking away. And the intent? To provoke a mid-air escalation involving you, Jalen replied. They wanted you restrained, humiliated your reaction, if any, caught on film, broadcasted, spun. Your upcoming negotiation was too dangerous for them to risk. The screen lit up with cascading data streams, source logs, access timestamps, and digital footprints leading straight to the forgery. The symbol of Varian Systems, his company, flickered beside the evidence as a silent reminder of what almost got buried. Draven's jaw tightened. They targeted my alias. Someone knew I wasn't flying as myself. Jalen nodded. Not someone, a team. We believe insiders at Halirex Dynamics coordinated the breach. They didn't hack the airline directly. They used someone already inside. Rylan? Draven asked, his voice laced with contempt. He was a pawn, Jalen said flatly. His record shows past disciplinary issues, overreaction, poor judgment. Someone exploited that, but he wasn't the only one. Draven leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Go on. Jalen tapped the tablet again, switching to a series of internal airline logs. A junior systems logistician named Brennan Corrin. He received an email 3 days ago with an urgent protocol update. Looked routine, but embedded inside it was the corrupted clearance file. He activated the bulletin unknowingly. That's what triggered the cascade. That's how Rylan saw the alert. Draven exhaled slowly, his mind racing. They built a perfect chain of plausible deniability. And hoped you'd break under pressure mid-air, Jalen added, but you didn't. And now we have something better than what you were carrying to Valisburg. Draven turned toward the rain-laced window. The storm had slowed, but its echo lingered in the glass. The encrypted files Rylan opened, he thought they were threats. Jalen nodded again. Instead, they contain proof of contract tampering, whistleblower suppression, and misappropriated funds, all pointing to Halirex. You were about to expose that. They got scared. A silence fell between them, heavy and purposeful. The secure room buzzed faintly with static from a nearby comms unit. The only sound interrupting the weight of what had just been confirmed, Draven finally turned back, his voice quiet but sharp. Then, let's make sure their fear was justified. Jalen smirked faintly and slid over a secondary data key. This contains the full forensic breakdown. It's enough to trigger a federal inquiry. Draven accepted the device, his grip firm. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, only focus, sharpened by betrayal. Start the inquiry, but don't announce it yet. Let them think I'm wounded. You want them comfortable, Jalen observed, folding his arms. No, Draven replied, standing. I want them visible. Jalen approached the monitors again. We'll keep our eyes on Brennan Corrin. He's not guilty, but he's a thread. If someone reaches out again, we'll know. Draven nodded slowly. The mental calculus was already underway. How to use the exposure, how to protect his company, how to tighten every gap that had allowed this breach. But more than that, how to rewrite the narrative that someone tried so desperately to control. Jalen, he said before stepping toward the door, the next time someone tries this, I don't want to be on a plane. I want to be waiting for them when they land. Jalen met his gaze with silent agreement. You'll have everything you need. Outside, the rain resumed its steady rhythm, softer now, like a warning whispered rather than screamed. Draven paused at the threshold of the room, absorbing the weight of what was unfolding, what had been prevented, and what still lay ahead behind him. The monitors pulsed with silent evidence. Ahead, the path was clear. Exposure, reform, retaliation. The attack meant to break him had only sharpened his purpose. The press lights flared hot against Draven's face as he stepped up to the podium in the conference hall at Vanguard Field. The room buzzed with soft murmurs, journalists adjusting their equipment, camera operators counting down in low voices. Outside, rain tapped steadily on the large glass windows, streaking down like lines drawn by a shaking hand. Inside, the air was cold and sterile, yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. Draven adjusted the microphone. No smile, no opening pleasantries, just a firm, composed presence. "There will be no names," he began, his voice calm and resonant, echoing just slightly against the stark concrete walls. "This is not about shaming individuals, but about protecting systems. Systems we depend on to keep truth and safety intact." Oh, he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Cameras zoomed in. A few reporters scribbled notes, others simply stared. "What happened today," he continued, his tone tightening just slightly, "was not a malfunction. It was not a misunderstanding. It was the weaponization of misinformation, and we were lucky that it was caught before it became something worse." Behind the scenes, just outside the conference doors, 2 CIB agents stood posted. Inside a nearby operations room, another team monitored live feeds from the aircraft and facility. As Draven spoke, Commander Jalen Voren watched from a secured terminal, his jaw tight, arms crossed over his chest. He didn't nod or speak. He listened, knowing every word carried dual purpose. Draven's speech flowed like a river guided by stone banks, firm but deliberate. He never mentioned Rylan, never uttered the airline's name. But those watching closely, especially the ones who had seen the phone-captured clips circulating online, knew exactly what he meant. In a world where digital alerts can be forged and fear can be activated with a single click, Draven said, restraint is no longer a courtesy. It is a form of courage, and responsibility is no longer optional. It is the backbone of national trust. His eyes swept the room. Not a single flashbulb popped. The silence was full, waiting. "Thank you," he said. He stepped down before anyone could ask questions. Aides swarmed in to close the briefing, but Draven didn't linger. As he exited through a side door, an agent in a dark suit stepped forward. No words, just a quiet nod, guiding him toward the internal corridor that led to the tactical command room. The heavy doors shut behind him, muting the world outside. Inside the operations suite, 3 men stood around a secured table displaying surveillance feeds, digital readouts, and encrypted intel. Commander Jalen stood at the center. "He confessed," Jalen said, his voice low. "Just broke down an hour ago." Draven stepped closer. "Rylan?" Jalen nodded once. Said he panicked, said the messages came fast from a source he couldn't trace, but he gave us the alias. Spectre Node. Draven went still. His spine straightened subtly, and the air in the room shifted. "You're sure?" "We confirmed the handle. It was active. Bounced through at least 4 foreign proxies before reaching the internal airline system." Draven didn't speak right away. His eyes narrowed slightly, processing the implications. "That's not just corporate sabotage anymore," he said finally. "That's strategic penetration of an airborne security channel." Jalen tapped on the tablet beside him. "CIB is scrambling 2 cyber response units. We're treating this as a precursor attack, a test pattern." "And the passengers?" "Safe. No press leaks yet, but the footage from inside the cabin is spreading. It's only a matter of time before someone connects dots publicly." Draven walked slowly to the window overlooking the tarmac rain, lashed against the reinforced glass, each drop illuminated by the red-blue rotating lights from tactical vehicles below. He folded his arms, absorbing the moment. "I need to know what their endgame was," he said. "You were the target," Jalen said, moving beside him, "but not just to hurt you, to provoke you, to force a reaction on camera that would compromise your position, or worse, endanger the contract meeting. You were bait in a pressure simulation." "And Rylan was the trigger," Draven muttered, almost to himself. Jalen's voice softened. "He wasn't the architect, just the matchstick." The lights flickered faintly as another wave of wind rattled the window. "They picked the wrong matchstick," Draven said. For a moment, both men stood in silence, watching the runway blur behind the downpour. Then Jalen spoke again. "We're laying groundwork for a full sweep. Digital, physical, internal audits. But we'll need your help." Draven turned slowly. "I'm already helping." He crossed the room, picking up the sealed folder that had been left for him on the central table. Inside were transcripts, access logs, and a timeline, compiled evidence tying the forged alert directly to the Spectre node breach. His encrypted documents, the same ones Rylan had waved around hours ago, were now part of the national record. "The speech," Jalen said, "hit harder than you know." Draven nodded once, then glanced back toward the terminal. "Let's make sure it's not the only thing that does." The room fell into quiet again as final operations commands were issued, the tactical team preparing for the next wave of seizures and interrogations. Outside, the press lights dimmed, the crowd beginning to disperse. And just as Draven stepped into the hallway leading back toward his transport, a young CIB officer jogged up, tablet in hand. "Sir," the agent said, holding out the device, "we've just confirmed additional data trails. The Spectre node alias has been active for the last 6 months. This wasn't a one-time breach." Draven took the tablet, his jaw tightening. "This isn't over," he murmured. He handed the device back, stepped into the elevator, and as the doors closed, the lights above flickered again, less from power disruption, more like the world subtly bracing for what came next. The world now knew part of the truth, but the deeper war was still hidden. The digital feed lit up with a trail of red flags. Draven Cole stood beside Commander Jalen Vorn in a secured subterranean operations hub beneath Vanguard Field, both staring at a holographic projection of the Spectre node data breach. The room buzzed with silent intensity, monitors flickering, encrypted signals bouncing across secure nodes, and a trio of CIB analysts hunched over terminals as lines of code spilled across black screens. The silence wasn't peace, it was focus laced with urgency. "Confirmed. Spectre node rerouted the forged alert through a masked relay inside Halyrex's West Coast server farm," said Malik Dorn, a senior cyber forensics agent, his voice tight, jaw clenched. "They used a blind token, a one-time clearance key stolen from an airport security subcontractor 6 weeks ago." Draven narrowed his eyes, his voice low. "So Halyrex didn't just target me. They were being used." Jalen nodded grimly, arms crossed over his chest. "And they didn't see it coming. This was more than sabotage. It was a test run, proof that someone outside could plant a fabricated threat, get it acted on, and disappear in the smoke." Draven stepped forward, the blue light from the digital feed tracing sharp shadows across his cheekbones. "Then Project Horizon Line begins now." The statement wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision. Within hours, Draven and Jalen assembled a specialized team composed of National Aviation Tech consultants, data integrity engineers, and CIB security architects. The goal was clear: build a barrier so advanced that no forged threat alert, no matter how cleverly disguised, could infiltrate operational protocols again. They worked in 12-hour rotations from a classified facility near the base. Draven's reputation now extended far beyond boardrooms. He was no longer just the architect of military-grade AI systems. He was the man who'd been bound mid-flight by a manipulated crew member and survived to rewrite the protocols that allowed it to happen. Every directive he gave was anchored in lived experience. Every feature he suggested in Project Horizon Line had weight. "Behavioral failsafes," he told the team. "The system must detect not just fake alerts but irregular behavioral patterns from those who receive them, like Rylan." It was Malik who uncovered the second breakthrough: archived personnel records that had been quietly sealed, illegally, years ago. "We found it," he said, dropping a flash drive onto the table. "Multiple disciplinary reports, paranoia under stress, flight simulation failures, passenger confrontation reports, all buried. Draven took the drive slowly, glancing over at Jalen. If this had been unsealed even once, Rylan wouldn't have passed clearance. Jalen exhaled sharply. Airline negligence, national liability. The data was enough to trigger a federal aviation audit. Word spread fast. Other airlines began preemptively reviewing their crew screening processes. Rylan's case, once just a dark corner of a single flight, had ignited national change. Behavioral audits for cabin staff became mandatory within days, a ripple effect from one restrained man's silence and control. Draven, meanwhile, prepared for his original mission, the negotiation meeting in Vallisburg. This time, he didn't board as Marcel Venton. He arrived under his real name, flanked by 2 plainclothes agents and a secure motorcade. The meeting had been delayed but not canceled, just transformed by everything that had unfolded. The conference room was lined with stone-gray panels, a minimalist space now guarded on all sides. Across from him sat representatives from the National Infrastructure Council. Their eyes were sharper now. Their respect, earned not by titles, but by evidence and character under pressure. He presented the encrypted documents, this time fully validated and forensically cleared. The data showed how Halirex Dynamics had manipulated systems and attempted to derail both a federal contract and a man's dignity. No dramatics, just proof. Measured words. Ironclad truth. The vote was unanimous. Varian Systems secured the contract, not because of what they promised, but because of what they had endured and exposed. Halirex, within days, began to collapse under the weight of federal inquiry. Executives were suspended, some detained, charges mounted. Their name became synonymous with recklessness and breach. As Draven stepped out of the building into the soft blush of early morning, he paused at the top of the steps. Light mist clung to the pavement. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of asphalt and rain. His briefcase in hand, his posture relaxed, but his mind already spinning toward what was next. His phone buzzed in his coat pocket. He glanced down. One new message. Jalen Voren. Spectre node has resurfaced. Draven exhaled slowly, lifting his eyes toward the horizon where the sky met the steel of the skyline. Calm. Ready. Justice had been served, but the horizon promised another battle. He mocked the restrained CEO and went pale when agents boarded the plane with a federal warrant, asking for him by name. If you believe true authority walks in quietly and ends the game in seconds, subscribe now, because justice doesn't knock, it enters. The story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, wrongful accusations, and the dramatic consequences that unfold when prejudice is exposed by truth and authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and treating every passenger with dignity and respect.